so the work of decolonizing any space is exposing what was always there. The notion that the acknowledgement that the operating paradigms are paradigms of non-neutrality. And so when you come into that space of non-neutrality, the question becomes, how do I play with this? And what is my accountability to this intellectual practice? So as I said, I'm here to share ways to nurture dissonance from a willful, intentful, anti-colonialistic way, and to be able to break through our existing paradigms and create something transformational for all of us. And so here to start, wanted to look at decolonizing false notions, things that get normalized in a systemic way, and that when we engage, our experience of the translations, the work, the methodology, the canons, then we have more opportunities to be empowered from an activistic perspective. So the first thing is that in big and smaller ways, supremacy is oftentimes presented as intelligence. So the more academically you can, for you to be seen as academically respectable or desirable, or for your work to be looked upon as academic, provenance on some level or cogent, a lot of the connections that are being made is how much do you perform the norm? And as I said, this is like step one. So in what ways, for example, is erasure rewarded? Is a very specific definition of academic acceptability in terms of the languages are acknowledged, in terms of the authorship and the scholarship that gets acclaimed. And on the flip side of that, there's also purism that is being produced and reinforced at this exclusionary monolithism. So there's one way to achieve, a state of desirability, and specifically in regards to the linguistics of our prose, it tends to cater to purism as that ethos. And here my invitation and challenge is to decompose purism into something that is fluidly nuanced and exists within a continuum. We're gonna get to that in a second. Then the other postulate I wanted to expose as a false notion that gets rewarded and claimed as well systemically is this definition of neutrality, right? As the justifying ethos. And my invitation and question as well to you is, do we consider neutral something that is normative and also that produces erasure? So is there this sort of institutional complacency, convenience, and fragility that protects neutrality insofar as it basically, reeks of the norm, the existing norm, and of the erasure? So who are we led to expect not to be present? And for that to be part of the convenience of the conversation? Whose voices destabilizes a conversation the second they're mentioned? So oftentimes, a lot of alternate or so-called alternate paradigms, it's a tool of segregation. So we have the canon, we have the norm, and we have those extrinsic attributes that are floating about. And so here it's looking that there's no true state of neutrality. And the question becomes, how are you going to mobilize yourself willfully within you being deliberately non-neutral in this space and conversation? And then there's anti-coloniality as radicalism. So in the same space and conversation, proposing, enforcing, nurturing alternate discourses is oftentimes perceived as a form of radicalism. And so here we want to look at the different ways that different types of discourse are looked at as academically impertinent, preferential, or unevidenceable. So when you come forward with this activistic lens, all of a sudden you are the most overtly non-neutral entity. We're not questioning that the space was already corrupted, but you are castigating for daring to acknowledge the unacknowledgeable. So those are my primary postulates, which is to say that you come into your work, a translation or a canon or a text or what have you, and I want you to be able to utilize those false notions as a checklist for yourself. Where is supremacy and thought being rewarded? And where is it what allows you to be performative of academic probity, academic respectability, academic desirability? On the flip side, where is purism, presented as this artificialized construct that is so staunchly monolithic? Where are we missing and lacking on nuance? And then the postulate of neutrality. Where is this information presented as if it were undeniably true, undeniably neutral? And what are the different opportunities that I have to see that it's not neutral, it's erasing of, it's on lack of neutrality, or it's erasing of specific voices, or it's simply the enforcement of normativity in this room, but it's not being challenged as what it truly is. And then the last part of the checklist is, where are divergent discourses that are part of the resistance, that are part of anti-coloniality, presented as extra, as superfluous, as radical, as impertinent, as irrelevant, as preferential, as biased. So those are ways that you can reappropriate this conversation, time and space, and bring it back to yourself, back home, and truly lean into being more than a thinker of change, but to be an enforcer of it systemically in your work. And as I said, whomever you are, whatever you do, you are equipped to be part of the necessary transformation of ethos. So when we take it a step further, I'm all about nurturing dissonance. So we understand the premise, we have some tools, now we can take it a step further. So there's a three-part to this part, this installment. First, it's anchoring nuanced polarity. So the notion that we can look at colonialism as existing here and anti-colonialism as existing on the other side. And there are so many different ways that you can be a bit of both at all times. And the beauty of being able to look at feminism and anti-colonialism as necessary part of translatology is to be able to ask better questions as well. When you're reading the text, for example, how can it be so that within the same text, the same problematicity, you can have part of it that is true and untrue at the same time? So the idea is not to demonize any given text or thought, is to be able to see that they all exist fluidly in a continuum. So from the most academically problematic piece of information, you can extract the most anti-colonialistic part of revelation. And it's to train your mind to be so critically self-aware that your capacity to enforce feminism and anti-colonialism is not dependent on the information presented to you, right? So this way we steer clear of being partisan of one way of doing things, but we can train our minds as academics, as translators, as linguists, to be non-partisan in a multi-partisan way. And so this goes back to exposing non-neutrality. How is this text behaving according to colonialism and anti-colonialism? Or what is the missed opportunity for it to be able to do a bit of both? Then there's also the multi-languaging of normative paradigms. And so going back to purism, the sense of there's a one academically acclaimed and correct way for you to perform language, right, in translatology. And so when we break this apart, it's looking to what other languages can be part of this conversation, but are being alienated by this conversation. Or what are ways that we can produce more heterogeneity into that text? So maybe having different variations of French, French that come from different peoples that we are never exposed to in a way that makes them normalizable. Or it could be literally different languages, but there's more than one way to speak French or English, for example. So whose English are we creating to? You see, so it goes back to the centering and decentering analysis. And again, you can have the one text and be able to infer all the missed anti-colonial potential and use that as a launch pad for you to be more awakened to change, but in a very proactive fashion. And then there's the nurturing of dissidence. So how do we deal with dissidence in academia as intellectual thinkers or as translators? So when we look at a text, for example, are we okay to deal with a text that behaves in non-conforming ways? Or when we come at a text that is presented to us as colonial, do we put on our thinking cap to look at how it can behave anti-colonially, or how we can force it to do so? So again, not to take the information presented to us as at face value, but to be able to nurture, to groom into that narrative something that transcends its own limitations. So for me, when we go back to Aileen's question of the distance between, let's say, consciousness and transformation, and our accountability to be part of both. It's one thing to theorize what can be, it's another thing to equip ourselves to show up as that possibility on purpose through our work. And those questions that you can reframe as checklists, are part of how you can groom yourself at every step of the way to reinforce, your own agency in being part of anti-colonial resistance. And so when we look at different ways for us to even be more granular when it comes down to, okay, how do I execute this? But not once in a while, but to how do I create specific touch points where I get to re-engage that conversation in a way that produces more anti-colonial intelligence. So for one, centering and sponsoring guest voices. So let's say you have a class, you have a course. So look outside of your own canon of preference, and then look to people that can come and supplement the narratives that you're here to impart, to decolonize, to deconstruct, a little bit like we're doing right now, for example. And those voices that can be sponsored and centered can be student voices, right? So again, changing the narrative a little bit more. Also decolonizing time as a construct. Why is it that a field has a beginning and an end date that's predictable? How can we interrupt that time flow? The interpretation that a lot of Blackness starts and ends with slavery, for example. So what way is it that we are appropriating time as a currency to make a supremacist mind frame the most inevitable outcome? What other way can I approach the narrative of time in my work where I don't presume that for that field to be legitimate, I need to understand what the colonization of that field started, right? Then there's defending non-neutrality. When I understand that me coming into a text, however academically brilliant it may be, it's also, fraught with different different elements of non-neutrality. The question is, what am I going to do about it? Am I going to defend the presumption that the state is neutral, or am I going to be able to tease out of it something that helps us move this conversation forward in a much more self-critical and also anti-colonial way? Then there's rewarding dissidence. No, we're not rewarded for dissidence, we're castigated for it. So what are different ways and mechanisms that we can turn this around? So it could be, for example, in using those checklists in different courses, and then having conversations around that text and take it to the one place that we were not conditioned to expect it could land. There's also the translinguality as the ultimate purism. When you truly lean into any given language, there's not a moment of time that we're isolated so much from the rest of the world that there were not, inter-influences in how we speak. So a lot of what passes as part of the purism paradigm, when you go back in time, you see that actually that we got that from Spanish. Actually, we got that from English. We got it from XYZ, right? So we curated an artificial understanding of what is pure. But when we truly do our due diligence, we understand that we were always cross-colonizing. And so here, the ultimate purism is translinguality. It's not having this rigid construct of, that's the one way to say XYZ. And when you center different Frenches, different Englishes, different Spanishes, different Creoles, and so on and so forth, it becomes very hard to stay enamored with the notion that one way of doing Frenchness is more or less valid than another one, because your canon is multiple. And then there's the disestablishment of institutional convenience and fragility. Oftentimes, when models like this are introduced, some people would say, well, how am I going to enforce this? And here the question becomes, is my institutional convenience and fragility the barometer for the feasibility of the project? So is it the correlation that I'm making that the more I feel or I choose to feel inconvenienced by that prospect, the more unfeasible it has to be? And again, as we've been talking about so far, I gave you different options and different ways to play with that, and I invited you repeatedly to be critically self-aware of ways that you can play with that construct. So when we look at it this way, and the tools that were provided to decolonize our field are fluid and nuanced, there's more than one way to resist. And there's also more than one way to stop resisting our own resistance. That said, it is feasible, but not particularly convenient, which means that we're doing something transformational. If I were to only sit within what has, what protects my fragility, how could I be a mobilizable part of change? So changing the metrics of what registers as necessary or as desirable. I desire to be inconvenienced, and I stop using my convenience, aka my fragility, as the reference point of what ought to happen for this to be legitimate. So those are my checklist items that you can play with. And the idea of what we said is taking this to fruition, co-creation, right? So you can take the different pieces of information shared and look back upon your work. And when you create different opportunities for yourself to have a different way of engaging feminism and anti-coloniality, you co-create new paradigms. A lot of the time, history stands of the shoulders of giants who passed, and we are not rewarded for our capacity to create new alternate worlds. And so I get castigated when I operate off script from the methodological protected reality. But again, coming at it from the perspective of I am accountable to something better than our norm. I want to be, or I can't get to be rewarded for my own dissidence, want to encourage our own capacity to outthink the system. And so the question becomes for me, what ought to be enforced into our centrality of thought be our commitment to instigate resistance and dissonance? So what if we get rewarded to resist and to desist at times? So that's me kind of bringing it full circle. I wanted to have much more of an action-driven model. I can share different theories, but they will stay just that. And while we're having a conversation about what can we do, what ought to be done, it's giving ourselves different ways of deconstructing our praxis from the meta-analysis of academic canon to then us being actively translating and teaching and learning and co-creating. So those are many different ways that you can look to your work and understand, going back to the checklist, am I producing, dissonance through resistance? And why am I creating those different, elements of a nuanced continuum between the expectation of supremacy as intelligence and the reality of anti-colonial resistance as desired non-neutrality? So it's playing with those ideas. When you're being fed something, presented with something as methodologically true, ask why, and who is rewarded for their abidement to that, and who is castigated for existing outside of that paradigm, and what are ways that we can basically shorten that gap and enforce our capacity to acknowledge that we've come into compromised systems and we have the capacity to exist beyond them. So that was my little spiel, as it were, and truly saying that you don't need to self-identify as intersectional even, as queer, as gender expansive, as Black to be part of that reality. And when you come into your work, also a question to ask yourself is, whose voices am I carrying forward? Am I only self-servicing my own positionality through my methodology? Or are there other, denied voices that are getting visibilized willfully within the scope of work that I have for myself?